this is silly, right? But we see this happen, right? Like the relational disconnect, like they park here and them park over here. They get to eat here in this cafe and them have to eat over here. Right? Like even in the most subtle of ways, we begin to break down the relational connection. We create perks for the leaders that don't exist for the followers. Right? We create rules for the followers that the leaders don't have to follow. And there becomes a relational breakdown, and the two camps emerge, leader and follower. And Jesus says this is fake leadership. This is fake leadership. You can begin to tell that you're starting to operate in the realm of fake leadership when the relational gap between leader and follower, and then the systems that come out as a result begin to split everybody into two camps. Okay? That's the first part. He says you're exercising authority over them, right? Second part then of this, I believe Jesus is teaching. You exercise authority over them. In fake leadership, there is no restraint to the use of the authority that the leader has. Remember, Jesus is speaking this into a time of maybe one of the most worldly, famous leaders ever, Caesar, right? Very little restraint of his authority or his power. And Jesus is saying in fake leadership, what they do is they exercise the full might of their authority over them. What might this look like? Full might of authority. Maybe it's like you're the leader and you have a greater intellect than the follower, and so you just intellectually beat that person down, right? Or the full extent of your authority is I'm boss and I said this and you do. The full extent of not holding back on the authority is what the fake leader does, is they realize the position, the status, the power, the wealth, the force of whatever other systems have been built in to supplant their leadership, and they will use it in full force to make sure there's compliance. I'm going to contrast all this, by the way, with real leadership later. Just setting up what fake leadership is. And so the first part of fake leadership, there's a relational disconnection. The second part of fake leadership is that there is no restriction, or there is no restraining of the authority or the power. They will use whatever they have to get their point across. Third element, they exercise authority over them. The third element here is this. They're exercising authority. Why are they exercising authority? So that they can, as I just alluded to, force compliance. And so the third element of fake leadership is this. They never have to rally. They can always just force. I can just push you. I can make you do this. And so whether this is in the church and you're telling people, hey, this is what you're doing and you're going to do it, or you're no longer going to be a part of this, right? Or this is in the business, and if you don't, then you will get fired. And what happens under this type of fake leadership is that, let me break things down into three camps. On camp number one, you have the people who want to. In camp number two, you have the people who have to. And then I would say there's like a third camp, which is like you are threatened to. And in fake leadership, they're never operating out of rallying people to the cause and moving in them to want to do something. In fake leadership, they can just be fine operating in the you have to do this. You have to do this or you'll get kicked out of the church. You have to do this or you will get fired. You have to do this, or you even go further and you say, we're going to threaten you. Like, I mean, we exist in a world right now where there's a lot of threats, right? Like, you will do this or you'll go to jail, or we'll kick you off of Facebook, or we'll, like whatever it might be. And we operate out of this like, we move people based on the threat of force. And so here's Jesus saying, here's how you can identify fake leadership. Is there a relational disconnect that's occurring between leader and follower? It's a sign of fake leadership. Is there no restraint ever of power, authority, might, superiority? It's a sign of fake leadership. He says, are the people following because they have to, or they're threatened to, or because they want to? Because if it's in either of those two camps, it's fake leadership. Okay? That's the first one. That's what when Jesus is saying they exercise lordship over them. Here's the second one. He says they're called benefactors. He says that the fake leaders, they're called benefactors. The first element of this is that they're called something. Don't we know you can be called something that you aren't? Like you can call somebody anything that you want to call them. That doesn't mean that they are. And other people can call themselves whatever that they want to be called, but that doesn't mean that they are. And in this, Jesus is saying they're called benefactors. I think what Christ is getting at is this. I think he's saying they're more interested in what they're called than what they accomplish. He said the leaders in the fake leadership, a sign of it is when you're more interested in well, what will people know me as? What will my title be? What will my role be? In church, this is like, okay, so am I just a volunteer or do I get to be called intern? Am I an intern now or do I actually get to be called staff member? I'm a staff member, but when do I get the pastor title? In retail, it's like, do I get a polo? Like, when will the word assistant manager be placed? When are we going to tell everybody else? And one of the signs of fake leadership is when you're more interested in what you're called than in what you accomplish. This happens multiple times in church, right? Where somebody will show up and they'll have been here for like 1 week or 1 hour. And all of a sudden they'll start asking the question like, hey, do you guys have any staff positions available? And I'll be like, I don't even know if you can vacuum, let alone hire you. Because vacuuming is actually a prerequisite to ever being on staff. You're more interested. The sign of fake leadership is when you're more, and we see this at every age and every stage. Where people chase a title, where they chase some type of status symbol, whether it's a label or a uniform. It's a sign of fake leadership. When we see it in younger people, we get an opportunity to go, well, you don't understand what you're doing. When we see it in older people, you go, how come you didn't learn this a long time ago? But it's a sign of fake leadership. So they're just interested in what they're being called, not in what they're actually accomplishing. Second thing, they're called benefactors. They're called benefactors. Now, a benefactor is somebody who's supposed to be benefiting other people. And Jesus is saying here, they're called benefactors, but they're not actually a benefactor because all of the benefit of what it is that they're doing is actually pointing back to them, not outward. And so they're just called a benefactor. And so one of the signs of fake leadership, and this one I think is actually the most gut-wrenching because what it makes us stop and do is ask ourselves the question of when I'm leading, when I'm making a leadership decision, when I'm starting a new program, when I'm issuing a new like, hey, this is where we're headed and this is what we're doing. When we're doing all of those things, is it ultimately about benefiting them or me? Because the moment I launch a new bonus program, the moment we say, hey, here's where we're going to start heading as a church, and this is where I really see you fitting in. Is it really about where that person fits in because it's good for them? Or is it really about getting them to fit into the cog of my wheel, which is ultimately just going to benefit me? And he's saying in fake leadership, what happens is the fake leaders create systems, we call them government programs, where the point is to actually ultimately end up benefiting them and not the people that they're supposed to be serving. And Jesus says that's how you can find fake leadership. Just look underneath a little bit, and what you're going to see is that in the end, all of the ultimate benefits go back to the person who started the thing. So that's fake leadership. They're just called benefactors. They're not actually benefactors. They're benefiting. And so here's Jesus saying this is what fake leadership is. And then he says this, but not so with you. Not so with you. Not so in our kingdom. Not so in this kingdom, Jesus is saying. That's not how we're going to do it. And then I think what Jesus does next, because Jesus is really smart, is he lays out what real leadership is, and he lays it out as a direct contrast to what it is that he has just said fake leadership is. And he says, not so with you. In the NLT, in Matthew 20, which is a parallel passage of this, Jesus says, but not so among you. Whoever wants to be the leader, or some translations say, whoever wants to be great. If you didn't understand the terminology of our conference, greater conference is about becoming more of a leader in Jesus' style. Real leadership. Jesus says, whoever wants to be a leader among you must be a servant and must be a slave. Must be a diakonos, must be a doulos. Servant and slave. That's what real leadership is. Jesus has just gotten done saying, fake leadership serves self. Fake leadership serves self. Real leadership, then Jesus says, serves people. Real leadership serves people. How does real leadership serve people? In the exact contrast to how the fake leadership does it. And so to understand real leadership, then all we have to do is understand fake leadership and then see the reverse. We call that the gospel flip, where it goes in, the gospel flips it around, and it comes back out the other side, the complete opposite of what everyone else was doing in the world. And so in real leadership, Jesus says you have to be a diakonos and a doulos. A diakonos is the word that we use for servant. And this word later, we would get our terminology in the church, deacon, which was a group of people who were called to serve the church. Now, oftentimes, we see in church structures and all of this, maybe we don't use the word deacon, we use the word staff member or somebody who's being like promoted to a position of authority. And it's interesting that we have taken this idea of deacon and we've turned it into this like position of power, when the original call of deacons was to do what? Somebody knows. Literally serve tables. Like the first leadership position created in the church era was waiter. Go serve a table. Go serve food. Right? And now it's been like, well, I want to become a deacon because I get something special or I get a vote. Right? And Jesus says, no, the first real leadership, you are a diakonos. You are a servant. You're a servant. Okay, so how did Jesus do this? How did Jesus do this? Well, he did it the complete opposite of the fake leaders. The fake leader did what? They created a relational disconnection between leader and follower. They had lordship over them. What did Jesus do? Literally went from over to down. I mean, actually was over because he is God over all things, and actually physically showed real leadership by going over all the way down to earth. So Jesus then shows what real leadership is in like a practical sense of saying, instead of exercising authority over them, I am going to serve under them or with them. In fact, he says, I am among you as the one who serves. You can only be among when you have relational connection between those whom you are serving. The fake leader is over. Jesus says the real leader is among. The real leader follows the same rules as the follower. The real leader is relationally connected in such a way so that they can actually be close enough to serve the person that's following them. And that's real leadership, Jesus says. I mean, the entire point of Christ coming was to do what? Restore relationship. So that's what the real leader does. The real leader looks for opportunities to both systematically and practically and to break down the barriers that exist then and to form relationship. Okay, that's first. The second thing then, what does he do? What did Jesus do? The fake leader never restrained their authority. Jesus was always restricting his power for the sake of his followers. Always. Jesus was authoritative without it being authoritarian. He had the full authority, but how did Jesus do this? Jesus, in his brilliance, would do what? Make the most complex things simple so that his followers could understand. Jesus, who literally on the cross is being said, hey, you could do this. And Jesus said, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to use the fullness of my power, even though I could. Why? So I can serve my people. That one of the elements of real leadership is even when you can, even when you could exercise the might of your tongue or the sheer force of your position, you don't and you refrain. Why? For the good of the follower. A couple ways that I think Jesus exercised this really well is in one of the ways is in how he restored people. How he restored people. How Jesus would use the position of his, he was perfect, right? And so when somebody in his little kingdom messed up, and I know everyone who leads something here thinks they're perfect and their employees always mess up, right? Or their people always mess up. And it's easy then in that moment to just step in and say, hey, because I'm perfect, let me step in and fix this. And Jesus, what would he do? How did he restore? Look how he restored people. Let it not be lost that the first person that Jesus commissions as a pastor is the person who had failed the most. Peter. Like Jesus was trying to teach us something. That the person in our organization who has failed the greatest might have the greatest opportunity to actually lead. He was teaching us something. He was teaching us that if we can refrain from lashing out and using the full authority of our position and actually restore as we're supposed to, then when we restore that person, then they might actually be the best opportunity for the thing to grow. It's possible that right now in your system and whatever it is that you lead, whatever it is that you do, that the person who has failed you greatest with the proper restoration might be the one who does the greatest. Another way I think this happened with Jesus, and this is kind of a tie into this, because I think this is important. When Jesus corrected, he always corrected without crushing. He always corrected without crushing. Now, we don't call it correcting anymore. Now we call it coaching, right? Because it sounds more modern. And so we call it coaching. I'm going to coach this person. I'm going to coach that person. Right? And Jesus, here's what I think Jesus knew about correcting or coaching, whatever word you want to use. Jesus knew that every time he had an opportunity to correct or coach someone, that it was either, and we see this in the text all the time, that it was either the beginning of that person's end or the beginning of their ascend to greatness. Every time he coached them, it was the beginning of the end or it was the beginning of their ascend. For the rich young ruler, Jesus stepped in, he said, let me show you what we're going to do. And he said, yeah, I'm out. That was the end. To Peter, he said, Peter, this is how we're going to do this, and this is how we're going to work. And what was it? It was the beginning of Peter's ascent. It means that you and I, every time that we have an opportunity to correct or to coach somebody, have to look at that moment and realize this is either going to be the beginning of the end, or this is going to be the beginning of this person's ascend to greatness. What an opportunity. What an opportunity that we have. And so Jesus here, he's reversing all of these things. Now, the third thing, right? The first thing was that the fake leader doesn't rally, they force. Well, look at Jesus. Jesus always rallied, not forced. Jesus always wanted the people who wanted to. He doesn't look and say, you have to, and he doesn't threaten them to, and he had a pretty good threat, like, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to hell. Right? Like that's a pretty good threat that he could have used. But what does Jesus do instead? Instead, what he's doing is he's constantly rallying them to the mission and to the call. Now, you might say, well then, Jesus had a pretty compelling vision, and he did. And that's important in this. But what it's also important for us to see in this, that what the real leader does is they set up the vision and they set up the mission of what we're trying to accomplish, because they want everyone who's going to be following them to want to. Because unless you get people to want to, then they will never do the things that you want them to. They will never sacrifice the way they need to unless they want to. People in the have to and the threaten to, people who are hanging out in this camp because our leadership is about forcing instead of rallying them, they might for a moment, but they either, when it gets hard or there comes a better opportunity, they're going to abandon. Real leadership, Jesus says, rallies people to, and then they'll be willing to sacrifice for what you're calling them to. And so Jesus gets done at the end, and a bunch of his people leave, right? One of his speeches. And they're all gone. And they've disappeared. And Jesus kind of looks at the disciples like, hey, y'all leaving too? And they go, we don't have anywhere else to go. Why? Because he, in his leadership, had moved them to a place of them saying, we want to be here. We don't care how hard the teaching is, and we don't care how tough it gets. We're sticking in. And you know that when you lead properly along the way, that when things get tough, when pandemics happen, when trouble happens to your ministry or your business or whatever it might be, that all of a sudden the leadership that you have been planting all along, the want to versus the have to or the threaten to, that those people in the want to camp become the people that you walk through the difficult season with, and all of the people in the have to or the threaten to camp quickly leave. But when you lead through rallying to the cause and getting people to want to, when you lead in that way, then the tough times come and you band together and you get through it and you're actually better on the other side. This is real leadership, Jesus says. Real leadership. Now, the other element of fake leadership was that they're called benefactors. They're called benefactors. They weren't actually benefactors. And Jesus says the opposite of this is being known as a slave. A slave. See, the benefactor has what? The fake leaders have what? They have slaves. They have slaves who ultimately bring them benefit. Jesus is saying we get to be slaves who ultimately bring other people benefit. And Jesus says, and he's using this term slave, doulos, which means galley slave, which is also a term that Paul would use much later. It was a position on the boat that meant you do the worst of the worst jobs. No job too small for the leader. Like as if Jesus is saying here, the sign of a place that has real leadership is when you walk in and you see someone cleaning the floors or the bathrooms and you think to yourself, not, oh, that must be the janitor. You think, oh, that must be the owner. That must be the owner. Because they're doing the worst of the jobs. Lowest of the low. That's what Jesus says. That's what real leadership is. No job too small for the real leader. No job too small. The slave knows three things. The slave knows this, that what he gets done is more important than what he's called. Why? Because he's always going to be called a slave. So the slave has realized titles don't matter anymore. Status doesn't matter anymore. When you're a slave, you're a slave, you're a slave. And so title, status, promote, all of that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters now is what can I get accomplished? And so Jesus says we're going to be slaves. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on not what we're called. In fact, that's why Jesus said, I will not count equality with God. Or Paul wrote this about Jesus. He didn't count equality with God as something to be grasped. He gave up his title so that he could be a slave. And the slave knows it's about what I get done, not what I'm called. And this can creep into it at any moment in our lives, at any level of our leadership. From the beginning to the end, where we want a greater title, we want more recognition, or we want people to know how we're doing or know what, and the example Jesus gives us is stop worrying about that and just worry about getting done what I've called you to get done. That's what the real leader does. Next thing the slave knows is this. The slave knows that the slave's ability to self-discipline him or herself will directly impact how much gets done. And I think this is a biblical principle. Paul says it this way, I beat my body and make it a slave so that I might not be disqualified. Jesus knew it this way. Jesus would often withdraw to do what? Pray. He would often withdraw to isolate himself. At the very beginning of the ministry, Jesus is out in the desert and he's being tempted by all of the things that that leaders get tempted with, right? Power and wealth and status, and basically everything that is the opposite of real leadership. The fake leader, Satan was basically calling Jesus to be a fake leader. That's what he was doing in the desert. He's calling him to be a fake leader. And Jesus, in his self-discipline, gets through that season of temptation. And in his humanity, had Jesus not, what happens to the rest of the mission? It's gone. What did Jesus know? That his self-discipline and self-control was directly tied to how well the thing he was leading would do. This might be the most personal I get this morning for you, and it's this, that your self-discipline And later, when Paul was describing the qualifications of an elder, what Paul was doing is not just saying, hey, this is how I need you to live. He was saying, no, this is how the people live who are actually able to do the job. He wasn't saying, live like this, and then you can become an elder. He was saying, I need elders who already live like this because that shows me that they'll be capable. Real leaders know that I have to self-discipline myself so that I can be positioned to actually slave myself out then to other people. I once had a staff member who could never show up on Sunday not looking hungover. I don't know if they were actually hungover. I hope not. I think they were just tired. And eventually it was, if you can't be self-disciplined enough to know that Sunday morning is the thing that matters most and that you need to get enough sleep on Saturday night, then there's no place for you to be a leader around here. Because you and I, our self-discipline, the way we discipline ourselves, will have a direct impact on the success of what it is that we lead. And right now, there might be one of you out there going, man, if we could just get this going, or if we could just work on our strategy, or if we could just do this, then the thing would keep growing. And what actually needs to happen is you just need to begin to discipline yourself enough to get yourself figured out. And then all of these other things are going to line up. I was listening to a podcast with the pastor of the largest church in the country, and he was talking about how they were working through COVID. And as he was doing it, he had to interact with another leader that he really respects. And he said, here's what happened. That leader called me in to his little office. I was at his thing. This is the guy who leads the largest, it was Craig Rochelle. He leads the largest church in the country. And he said, he's sitting there talking to this other guy that he respects. And he said, hey, I'm not interested in your strategy right now. I'm not interested in the new initiatives you guys are going to do. I've got 3 questions for you. How are you sleeping? How's your wife?